May 1941. Adolf Hitler stood within the map chamber of the Reich Chancellery, his gaze fixed upon a detailed model of the Bismarck. 50,000 tons of formidable steel, representing the apex of German naval engineering, the most formidable warship Germany had ever conceived. Its armament boasted 8 15-inch guns, protected by armor so substantial it could effortlessly repel any ordnance the British could muster. He had unequivocally declared it unsinkable. Yet, within 3 days, this titan of the seas would rest at the ocean floor, swallowed by the Atlantic. The very words he uttered upon learning of its demise would reverberate through the ensuing 4 years of global conflict. But before its tragic end, it had to embark on its maiden voyage. The Bismarck commenced its sortie from Gotenhafen Harbor on May 18, 1941. Its austere gray hull cleaved the Baltic Sea with the precision of a razor's edge. On the vessel's bridge, Admiral Gunther Lutyens, a man of 57 years with an unyielding countenance, observed the receding coastline. He had been entrusted with the command of Operation Rheinübung, a bold thrust into the Atlantic intended to cripple British supply routes. Accompanying the Bismarck was the heavy cruiser Prinz Eugen. Together they were meant to showcase the superiority of German craftsmanship to the Royal Navy. Lutyens harbored reservations. While the Bismarck possessed immense power, it sailed in isolation. Its sister ship, the Tirpitz, was not yet operational, and the Scharnhorst and Gneisenau were undergoing repairs. This expedition would commit Germany's newest and most costly battleship to the North Atlantic with minimal support, facing the entirety of the British home fleet. Lutyens had advocated for postponement, but Hitler, driven by a desire for swift victories, had overruled him. The U-boat campaign was slowly strangling Britain. But Hitler craved a more decisive blow, a surface raider, a symbol of German might, decimating British cruisers and sinking merchant vessels by the score. This, he believed, would shatter British morale and demonstrate Germany's dominion over the oceans. Thus, the Bismarck navigated northward through the Norwegian fjords, replenishing its supplies in Bergen. It was here that British reconnaissance aircraft detected their presence. On May 21st, the Royal Navy began to mobilize its forces. Admiral Sir John Tovey, commanding the home fleet from HMS King George V, ordered every available vessel to intercept. The battlecruiser Hood, the pride of the Royal Navy, along with the newly commissioned battleship Prince of Wales, steamed towards the Denmark Strait, their path punctuated by cruisers fanned out in a wide search pattern. This was no mere commerce raid. It had escalated into a determined hunt. As evening descended on May 23rd, the cruiser HMS Suffolk detected the Bismarck on its radar in the Denmark Strait, the narrow passage between Iceland and Greenland. Lutyens knew they had been compromised. He faced a stark choice: retreat, abandon the mission, and return to Germany without achieving anything, or press onward, relying on the Bismarck's formidable guns and armor to overcome any British opposition and break into the open Atlantic, where convoys lay vulnerable like sheep. He chose to press onward. At precisely 5:52 in the morning on May 24th, the Hood materialized on the horizon, its colossal silhouette unmistakable even in the dim pre-dawn light. Vice Admiral Sir Lancelot Holland commanded from the Hood's bridge. Following closely was the Prince of Wales, presenting 2 capital ships against 2. Holland ordered a rapid approach to close the distance and bring all guns to bear. His crew had undergone extensive training for such an engagement. For 2 decades, the Hood had reigned as the largest warship afloat, a potent symbol of British naval supremacy, manned by a crew of 1,400 souls, most of whom were about to meet a tragic fate. At 5:53, the Hood unleashed its opening salvo from a range of 25,000 yards. Massive shells arced through the air, answered by the Bismarck's own guns. The sea churned with towering columns of water as shells fell short or, in some cases, straddled the British vessels. The range closed, 20,000 yards, then 18,000. The Hood's fifth salvo landed perilously close to the Bismarck. The Prince Eugen's shells found their mark, striking the Hood and igniting a fire. Then the Bismarck's fifth salvo impacted. One, possibly two shells penetrated the Hood's deck armor. The subsequent explosion was a terrifying spectacle, visible for miles, erupting in a fiery plume that shot 1,000 feet into the sky. The Hood's back broke. Its bow and stern rose, while its midsection simply vanished in a conflagration of fire and smoke. Merely 3 minutes after the devastating hit, the Hood was gone, taking 1,415 men to their watery graves. Only 3 survived. On the Bismarck's bridge, the crew erupted in cheers. They had just vanquished the pride of the Royal Navy in less than 10 minutes. Lutyens allowed himself a faint, fleeting smile. The British would undoubtedly be reeling. The Prince of Wales, still in the process of working up its crew, withdrew under fire, having sustained multiple hits. The path to the Atlantic now lay open, with one critical caveat. The Bismarck was leaking oil. The Prince of Wales had inflicted 3 hits before disengaging, one of which had breached the forward hull, rupturing fuel tanks. A slick of oil now trailed in their wake. Not a critical blow, but significant enough to leave a discernible trail, curtail their operational range, and compel Lutyens to reassess his plan. He detached the Prince Eugen, dispatching it southward to conduct independent raids. The Bismarck would set course for the French coast, aiming for the port of Brest to undergo repairs. They had achieved something momentous. They had sunk the Hood. That, they presumed, would have to suffice. The British, however, held a different view. Upon learning of the Hood's destruction, Winston Churchill famously uttered 3 words: "Sink the Bismarck." Every ship, every aircraft, every resource the Royal Navy could muster was directed towards the North Atlantic. Tovey pushed HMS King George V to her maximum speed. The aircraft carrier HMS Victorious launched its Swordfish torpedo bombers. The battleship HMS Rodney, which had been escorting a convoy, abandoned its charges and turned towards the Hunt. Cruisers maintained radar contact, shadowing the Bismarck throughout the night. At 11 o'clock in the evening on May 24th, 9 Swordfish aircraft from the Victorious located the Bismarck in the fading light. These obsolete biplanes, fabric-covered and barely faster than a car on a highway, wobbled through a hail of heavy anti-aircraft fire. One torpedo struck the Bismarck amidships, causing minimal damage but unsettling Lutyens. The British knew his precise location and were relentless in their pursuit. At 3 o'clock in the morning on May 25th, the Bismarck broke contact. A sharp turn, a period of radio silence, and suddenly the British lost their radar lock. For 31 agonizing hours, their ships crisscrossed the vast ocean, burning precious fuel, finding nothing. Lutyens believed he had escaped. he broke radio silence to transmit a lengthy message to Germany, detailing the engagement and requesting air cover upon approaching the French coast. British direction-finding stations triangulated the transmission, reacquiring their target. However, the pursuit was becoming increasingly desperate. The King George V was critically low on fuel, and the Rodney was operating at the extreme edge of its range. If the Bismarck reached French waters, German U-boats and aircraft would provide protection. The window of opportunity was rapidly closing. At 10:30 in the morning on May 26th, a Catalina flying boat spotted the Bismarck, still 690 miles from Brest. It was still too far. The only British vessels close enough to intercept were Force H, advancing from Gibraltar, comprising the aircraft carrier HMS Royal, the battlecruiser HMS Renown, and the cruiser HMS Sheffield. Tovey ordered the Royal to launch all available aircraft. At 3 o'clock in the afternoon, 15 swordfish took off from the pitching deck of the Royal. The weather was deteriorating rapidly, with heavy seas and low cloud cover. They located a vessel on radar and attacked through the squall. Their torpedoes missed. They had mistakenly attacked the Sheffield, one of their own cruisers. They returned to the Royal, rearmed, and launched again at 7 o'clock. This time, they would ensure their target was correct. The second strike located the Bismarck at 8:47 in the evening. 13 swordfish aircraft flew at wave height, their path through the air filled with the roar of anti-aircraft fire. The Bismarck maneuvered sharply, attempting to evade the torpedoes. Most missed, but 2 found their mark. One struck amidships, causing negligible damage. The second, however, hit the stern, jamming the rudder at an angle of 40 degrees to port. The ship was rendered virtually uncontrollable, beginning to turn in slow circles, incapable of steering or escaping. Engineers attempted in vain to free the rudder and rig emergency steering. The vessel was crippled, mere 400 yards from safety, with the entire British home fleet closing in. Lutyens sent a final, defiant message to Germany. "Ship unmaneuverable. We will fight to the last shell. Long live the Führer." In Berlin, Admiral Erich Raeder received the message at midnight. He had served as Commander-in-Chief of the Navy since 1928, the architect of Germany's surface fleet and a vocal advocate for battleship construction, often clashing with Hitler's preference for U-boats. The Bismarck was his vindication, tangible proof that capital ships still held strategic importance. Now it was trapped, crippled, and doomed. He had to inform Hitler. He found the Führer in his study, engrossed in reviewing maps of the Eastern Front. Operation Barbarossa, the invasion of the Soviet Union, was slated for June. Hitler was consumed with planning the massive redeployment of forces and the execution of history's grandest military undertaking. Raeder's news shattered his concentration. According to Raeder's later account, Hitler's face turned ashen. He stood, knocking papers from his desk. "The Bismarck? Crippled?" he exclaimed. "How?" Raeder explained the torpedo hit, the jammed rudder, the encroaching British fleet. Hitler's voice rose. "You told me it was unsinkable. You assured me British ships could not match it. You promised this operation would succeed." Raeder had no adequate response. Hitler paced, hands clasped behind his back, a posture he adopted when exerting his will. "Can we save it?" he inquired. "U-boats? Aircraft?" Raeder shook his head. Too far from land, the weather was too poor for effective air support. U-boats were en route to intercept, but they would not arrive in time. The Bismarck would have to fight alone. Hitler stopped pacing and turned to Raeder. "Then it will sink," he stated quietly. "And when it does, Admiral, you will explain to me why I should ever trust the surface fleet again." At dawn, on May 27th, the Bismarck wallowed in heavy seas, still trapped in its slow, unsteerable circles. The crew was utterly exhausted, having been at action stations for 3 days. They understood what was imminent. At 8:43, HMS Rodney and HMS King George V appeared on the horizon, followed by the cruisers HMS Dorsetshire and HMS Norfolk. The Bismarck was surrounded. At 8:47, the Rodney opened fire with its 16-inch guns, joined moments later by the King George V. The Bismarck's guns responded. The initial salvos were accurate, straddling the British vessels. Then, the Rodney's third salvo struck the Bismarck's forward turrets. The Anton turret was destroyed, and the Bruno turret was disabled. The Bismarck's primary offensive capability was neutralized within minutes. The British ships closed to point-blank range, 3,000 yards, making misses impossible. They unleashed a torrent of shells into the Bismarck's superstructure. The bridge was hit, killing most of the command staff. Lütjens perished there, remaining at his post. Captain Ernst Lindemann, the Bismarck's commander, died shortly thereafter. The ship was a burning wreck, its guns silenced, yet it refused to sink. The armor belt held fast. British shells could not penetrate deep enough to reach the magazines, the engine rooms, or the vital spaces below the waterline. At 10:15, Tovey, observing from the King George V, found his fuel reserves dwindling. He had expended 700 shells, while the Rodney had fired nearly 400. The Bismarck was a flaming hulk, clearly vanquished, yet still afloat. He ordered the cruiser Dorset to finish it off with torpedoes. On board the Bismarck, the surviving crew made their final decision. They had fought until their guns were silent, until their ship was unrecognizable. They would not allow the British to claim it as a prize. Engineering parties descended below decks, opened the seacocks, and set scuttling charges. The ocean poured in. At 10:36, the Dorset fired 3 torpedoes. 2 struck home, but the Bismarck was already succumbing to the scuttling charges. The bow dipped beneath the waves, the stern rose, propellers spinning uselessly in the air. Men plunged into the freezing water, clinging to debris. The Dorset and other ships moved in to rescue survivors. Then, a U-boat alarm sounded. A false alarm, as it turned out. But the British ships fled, abandoning hundreds of German sailors to the unforgiving sea. Of the 2,200 crew members, only 110 were rescued. The rest drowned or succumbed to exposure in the ensuing hours. The Bismarck slipped beneath the waves at 10:40 a.m., precisely 3 days after sinking the Hood. The news reached Berlin that afternoon. Raeder personally conveyed the report to Hitler. The Führer was in a meeting with his army chiefs, planning Barbarossa. Raeder waited until the meeting concluded before delivering the grim tidings. The Bismarck had been sunk. Over 2,000 men lost. The British were jubilant. Churchill had addressed Parliament, extolling the Royal Navy's victory. Hitler listened impassively. When Raeder finished, a long silence ensued. Then Hitler spoke, his voice cold and precise. "The surface fleet is a waste of resources," he declared. "Every ton of steel in those ships could have built tanks. Every man crewing them could have fought in Russia. The British have 100 ships for every one of ours. They will always have more. They will always win." Raeder attempted to argue that a single loss did not invalidate the entire strategy. The Tirpitz was nearing completion, and the Scharnhorst and Gneisenau would soon be repaired. They could still threaten British convoys and tie down Royal Navy resources. Hitler cut him off. "No more offensive operations," he commanded. "The big ships will remain in port. They will be a threat, but they will not sail. Let the British worry about them. Let them keep ships in home waters, guarding against raids that will never occur. But I will not lose another capital ship in a pointless gesture." It was not precisely the end of the German surface fleet. The Tirpitz would sortie occasionally, menacing Arctic convoys. The Scharnhorst would sink in 1943 while attempting to attack a convoy. But Hitler's pronouncement that day marked a fundamental strategic shift. Henceforth, the Navy's capital ships would become a fleet in being, a perpetual threat that never fully materialized, consuming resources without yielding tangible results. Conversely, the U-boat arm received everything it needed: more boats, more men, more support. Karl Dönitz, commander of the U-boat fleet, became Hitler's favored naval officer. When Raeder resigned in 1943, Dönitz succeeded him as commander-in-chief. The strategy that nearly starved Britain into submission, the wolf packs that sank millions of tons of shipping, that was Hitler's preferred mode of naval warfare. Not grand surface duels, but submarines striking from the depths. However, there was more to Hitler's reaction than mere strategic calculation. Those present in the days following the Bismarck's sinking reported a deeper, more personal fury. He had invested immense resources in the ship, approving its construction against objections regarding cost and time. He had overridden Lütjen's concerns about sailing without adequate support. He had placed faith in Raeder's assurances that the Bismarck was superior to any vessel the British could field. And in just 3 days, it had been hunted down and destroyed. Hitler abhorred being wrong. He despised embarrassment. The sinking of the Hood had been trumpeted in German propaganda as irrefutable proof of German superiority. Newsreels depicted the Bismarck sailing forth, invincible and unstoppable. Now those same newsreels had to be withdrawn. The narrative had to be rewritten. The Bismarck had fought heroically against overwhelming odds, a tragic loss, but a moral victory. The propaganda ministry worked overtime to spin the disaster. But Hitler knew the truth. Germany had lost its newest and most powerful battleship on its very first operation. The British had demonstrated their capacity to hunt down and sink any German surface ship, regardless of its might, if they committed sufficient resources. The Atlantic was not Germany's to raid. It was Britain's to defend, and they would do so with every means at their disposal. In private conversations over the subsequent weeks, Hitler repeatedly returned to the subject. He interrogated Raeder about every decision, every tactical choice Lütjens had made. Why hadn't they turned back when spotted? Why hadn't they finished off the Prince of Wales? Why hadn't they evaded the pursuit? Raeder offered no satisfactory answers. Lütjens had made reasonable decisions based on the information available. The British had simply been superior, luckier, and more determined. This was what Hitler found unacceptable. The notion that the British could prevail, that German technology, German training, and German resolve could be defeated by an enemy he had been conditioned to view as decadent and weak, a fading power. The Royal Navy had dominated the seas for centuries. This was supposed to be Germany's century, and the Bismarck was meant to prove it. Instead, it proved the opposite. It demonstrated that Britain's navy, despite its aging ships and seemingly outdated doctrines, still possessed an unparalleled ability to fight. It underscored that aircraft carriers, not battleships, represented the future of naval warfare. Those obsolete swordfish biplanes, flying at barely 100 miles per hour, had crippled the most modern battleship in the world. The lesson was clear, yet Hitler refused to learn it. Instead of investing in carriers, he largely abandoned surface warfare. There is a story, possibly apocryphal, that circulated among Hitler's staff after the sinking. He had been observed looking at the model of the Bismarck in his map room, the very model he had so proudly displayed to visitors. An aide reportedly found him late one night, standing silently, gazing at it. The aide inquired if he wished for the model to be removed. Hitler supposedly shook his head. "Leave it," he is said to have uttered. "Let it remind me that the sea belongs to the British. We will win this war on land." Whether that conversation took place or not, the sentiment it conveyed was undeniably real. After May 27, 1941, Hitler's focus shifted almost entirely to the Eastern Front. The invasion of the Soviet Union commenced 5 weeks later. The colossal tank battles, the brutal sieges, the relentless infantry combat. These were the arenas of warfare Hitler understood. Ships were abstract entities, distant pieces on a map he could not directly control. Armies were tangible forces he could command, observe their results, and bend to his will. The Bismarck's loss reinforced every instinct Hitler possessed about naval warfare. Its unpredictability, its dependence on weather, luck, and technologies he did not fully grasp. It placed Germany's most expensive assets at the mercy of the British, who possessed more ships, greater experience, and a superior capacity to absorb losses. It was far preferable, in his view, to fight where Germany held the advantage, on land, with tanks, artillery, and infantry. Raeder never regained Hitler's trust. Their meetings became strained and adversarial. Hitler questioned every proposal, every request for resources. When Raeder suggested building aircraft carriers, Hitler scoffed. "With what steel?" he demanded. "With what shipyards? With what time? The British have 6 carriers in service and more under construction. We would finish our first carrier in 1944, if ever, and by then the war will be decided on land in Russia." The final break occurred in December 1942, during the Battle of the Barents Sea, where German destroyers and cruisers failed to destroy a British convoy despite numerical superiority. Hitler erupted in rage. He ordered all major surface ships to be decommissioned, their guns removed and installed in coastal fortifications, and their crews transferred to U-boats. Raeder resigned in protest. Dönitz took over, eventually convincing Hitler to keep the larger ships in commission, though they rarely sailed again. But returning to that pivotal day, May 27, 1941, when the news first arrived, Hitler's immediate reaction preceding any strategic calculations or recriminations, was starkly simple. He had lost. The British had won. The ship he had christened Unsinkable now rested at the bottom of the Atlantic. And the words he had used to describe it, the confidence he had projected, the assurances he had given, all of it had been exposed as hollow by 3 days of relentless pursuit and 1 morning of utter destruction. How? He had demanded of Rader. How did this happen? As if there should have been some conceivable way to prevent it, some singular decision that would have altered the outcome. But there was none. The moment the Bismarck sailed into the Denmark Strait, the moment it sank the Hood and announced its presence to the world, the Royal Navy was irrevocably committed to its destruction. They would have pursued it to the Arctic, to the South Atlantic, even to the Indian Ocean if necessary. One does not sink the pride of the fleet and simply sail away. The British would never permit such an affront. Lutyens had understood this. His final message, "We will fight to the last shell," was not an act of defiance, but of acceptance. He had known from the moment that torpedo jammed the rudder that the Bismarck was doomed, that his crew was doomed. He remained on the bridge and went down with his ship because there was nothing else left to do. Hitler never comprehended such fatalism. He believed in sheer will, in unwavering determination, in the refusal to accept defeat. The notion that one could simply be beaten, that an enemy might be stronger, luckier, or better positioned, that was an alien concept to him. There had to be someone to blame, some failure to identify and punish, but in this instance, there was no one. Lutyens had followed his orders. Lindemann had commanded his ship admirably. The men displayed remarkable bravery and aptitude in their engagement. However, the British proved to be superior in their execution. They skillfully employed radar technology, synchronized multiple units, adjusted their approach when communication was lost, and ultimately delivered the decisive blow that sealed the fate of the Bismarck. War can be an unforgiving mistress. One can execute every maneuver flawlessly and still emerge defeated. Adolf Hitler, however, never truly absorbed this hard-won understanding. For the remainder of the conflict, he relentlessly sought methods to guarantee victory, to eradicate any element of chance, and to force reality to conform to his singular will. This compulsion led him to meticulously oversee every operation, to disregard the counsel of his seasoned generals, and to stubbornly defend every single parcel of territory, even when a strategic withdrawal was the sole rational course of action. The sinking of the Bismarck served as a stark revelation to him that the world was inherently unpredictable and beyond absolute control. His reaction was to intensify his attempts at rigid dominion. The profound irony is that the Bismarck's sortie did achieve a significant outcome, though not one that Hitler had envisioned. It effectively immobilized a vast quantity of British naval assets. More than 100 vessels were engaged in its pursuit. Resources such as fuel, ordnance, and precious time were all consumed in the endeavor to sink a single formidable battleship. Had Germany persisted with its aggressive surface fleet operations, had they consistently risked their capital ships, they might have compelled Great Britain to maintain an even larger concentration of its naval forces in home waters, thereby diverting them from the Mediterranean theater and from their vital convoy escort duties. Nevertheless, Hitler's subsequent response effectively curtailed any such possibility. Following the Bismarck's demise, the German surface fleet adopted a posture of passivity and defense, becoming a decaying asset. Its formidable vessels remained largely stationary in Norwegian fjords, occasionally posing a perceived threat, but rarely venturing out. While British aircraft carriers and battleships were indeed required to monitor this presence, they were not engaged in a protracted chase across the vast expanse of the Atlantic, expending fuel and ammunition in pursuit. The threat posed was, by comparison, a manageable one. Had Hitler declared, "We have lost one vessel, we shall construct more, we will persevere," the trajectory of the naval war could have been substantially different. Instead, his pronouncement was an emphatic, "Never again." Consequently, the German surface navy faded into insignificance. This was Hitler's true response to the Bismarck's destruction. It was not merely an outburst of anger over the loss, but a fundamental repudiation of the entire strategic concept. He had placed a substantial wager on a commerce raider operating in the Atlantic, disrupting vital supply lines. This gamble had failed in spectacular fashion. His chosen course of action was to never again engage in such a risky endeavor. He resolved to concentrate on the U-boat campaign, to focus on land warfare, and to confine his efforts to arenas he understood and could exert a degree of control over. 3 days. That was all it took to fundamentally alter Hitler's entire naval strategy. A mere 3 days elapsed from the obliteration of the Hood to the sinking of the Bismarck. 3 days that laid bare the limitations of German naval power and underscored the enduring might of the Royal Navy. 3 days that Hitler would never forget, and that profoundly shaped his subsequent decisions throughout the remainder of the war. The Bismarck now rests 3 miles beneath the Atlantic's surface, fractured in two, its formidable guns silenced, its crew forever entombed within the wreckage. Explorers have since visited the site, documenting and photographing the remains. Swastikas, once emblazoned on the stern, were still discernible during early expeditions, though the relentless embrace of the ocean is gradually reclaiming all. Hitler himself never set foot on the ocean. He harbored a distinct fear of water and felt ill at ease aboard ships, preferring the solidity of mountains and the tranquility of forests. The sea remained an alien domain to him, and this perception was solidified by the Bismarck incident. He delegated naval matters to his admirals, concentrating his own focus on the land campaigns that ultimately led to Germany's downfall. However, for a brief period, on May 27, 1941, he was compelled to confront the stark realities of naval warfare, the inherent risks, the pervasive uncertainty, and the potential for catastrophic defeat, even in the face of technological superiority. His subsequent reactions, the words he spoke to the raider, and the strategic choices he made in the weeks that followed, reverberated throughout the remainder of the conflict. The surface fleet would never again pose a significant threat to the Atlantic sea lanes. The U-boat arm would bear the brunt of the naval war, and ultimately, they too would fall short of their objectives. Hitler would then irrevocably shift his full attention to the Eastern Front, to the land war that consumed all resources and culminated with Soviet tanks rolling into Berlin and Hitler's demise within his bunker. All of these monumental events trace their origins, in part, to those three pivotal days in May of 1941, when the British meticulously hunted down and sank the Bismarck, and Hitler learned a critical lesson: that certain entities, regardless of their immense power or advanced sophistication, can still be overcome by an adversary possessing sufficient resolve and a measure of good fortune. This was the profound lesson of the Bismarck. Hitler learned it, but he never truly accepted its implications, and that singular failure made all the difference.